The first sign of trouble came quietly, without warning, on a breezy Thursday morning. The sun was barely climbing over the horizon when the homeowner stepped outside to fetch the paper. Coffee still warm in their hands, and saw it, a bright yellow slip, taped boldly across the front door. The official HOA emblem sat at the top, a seal that always seemed to loom like a threat rather than a badge of community. The message was short but piercing. According to the notice, the yard was out of compliance with neighborhood standards. It was labeled illegal, a term chosen deliberately, heavy enough to sound criminal, but vague enough to avoid explaining much of anything. The homeowner read it twice, then a third time, searching for details that simply weren't there. What exactly was illegal? The grass, the flower beds, the new stone walkway installed just a few weeks earlier? Every detail of the yard had been cultivated with care. The lawn was trimmed, the shrubs pruned, and the flower garden neatly lined in seasonal blooms. Nothing about it suggested neglect or chaos, yet the HOA had singled it out like a crime scene. At first, it felt like a mistake. Perhaps the notice had been intended for another house, one of those properties at the edge of the block where weeds grew unchecked. But the homeowner's name was right there in bold type, a silent accusation left for neighbors to see. And in this neighborhood, appearances mattered. As the day went on, the slip became impossible to ignore. Every glance at the front yard was now filled with doubt. Was the new landscaping too unconventional? Did the decorative stones clash with the monotonous lawns of the block? The HOA had always favored uniformity, discouraging individuality in the name of community harmony. But labeling the yard illegal went beyond a friendly reminder. It felt like a declaration of war. Word spread quickly. Neighbors who had once waved with polite indifference now eyed the house with thinly veiled curiosity. Some shook their heads as if to say, "You should have known better." Others whispered over fences, speculating about what rule had been broken. In a place where conformity was currency, standing out even unintentionally invited suspicion. The homeowner felt the weight of dozens of unspoken judgments pressing down. That night, the homeowner pulled out the thick HOA handbook, flipping page after page, searching for the violation. The rules stretched on like a labyrinth of restrictions. Grass height must be no more than 2.5 inches, fences no taller than 4 feet. Holiday decorations permitted only for 2 weeks. Before and 1 week after the holiday, approved colors listed in a palette of dull grays and tans. Yet nothing in the book described the yard as illegal. Nothing explained why this particular property had been targeted. The only clue came in the form of a name whispered by a sympathetic neighbor. Later that week, Karen, she was the self-appointed enforcer of the HOA board, a woman whose life seemed to revolve around spotting deviations and filing complaints. She lived just 3 houses down, her blinds often tilted open as if they were surveillance cameras. Everyone in the neighborhood knew her reputation. Her yard was immaculate, sterile even, with every blade of grass the exact same height, every bush trimmed into perfect spheres. To her, the neighborhood wasn't a collection of families, it was a stage for control. And she was the director. It became clear that Karen had set her sights on the yard. Whether out of jealousy, spite, or sheer boredom, she had declared it an offense to the order she so desperately clung to. And now, through the HOA, she held the power to make life miserable. The first notice was followed by a second, more threatening in tone. This time it carried the word fine, with a fee attached if the supposed violation wasn't corrected within 10 days. Again, no explanation, just a vague insistence that the yard was non-compliant. The threat was unmistakable: pay, change, or face escalating penalties. For many homeowners, this would have been the moment to cave, to rip out the landscaping, repaint the trim, or mow the grass twice a week just to appease the board. That was how Karen and the HOA maintained control. They thrived on intimidation, on homeowners too weary or afraid to fight back. But not this time. Instead of giving in, the homeowner began documenting everything. Photos of the yard from every angle, screenshots of the handbook showing no such rule existed, records of fines, and notices filed away neatly in a folder. Each piece of evidence became a small act of defiance, a brick in the wall being built against the HOA's bullying tactics. Yet defiance came at a cost. More letters arrived, the fines stacking higher, threats escalating from financial penalties to the possibility of legal action. Neighbors avoided eye contact now, afraid of being seen as sympathetic. Even friends urged compliance, worried that standing out would only bring more trouble. It felt like an isolated battle, one homeowner against the machinery of control. But beneath the frustration and fear grew something stronger: resolve. If Karen wanted a fight, she would get one, and it wouldn't be a quiet surrender hidden behind closed doors. No, this battle would unfold in the open, every step documented, every injustice laid bare. The homeowner wasn't just protecting a yard anymore. This had become a matter of principle, a stand against the pettiness and control that ruled the neighborhood. And in the end, it wouldn't be Karen with the last word, it would be the homeowner with the last laugh. The stage was set, the lines drawn. What began as a single notice taped to a door was about to ignite into a conflict that would shake the entire community. The second notice hadn't even finished sinking in before the third arrived. This one came with a sharper edge, its language cold and absolute. It stated that continued refusal to correct the yard would result not only in additional fines, but also in legal enforcement measures that could include liens against the property. The words were chosen carefully, dripping with intimidation. It was no longer a matter of community standards, it was a financial threat, designed to crush resistance. The homeowner read the letter slowly, holding it in their hands as if it were a weapon. In a sense, it was. This was the HOAS playbook in full display: overwhelm, frighten, and isolate. Most people, when faced with the prospect of endless fines and possible court battles, would buckle. But this wasn't most people. Instead of backing down, the homeowner went deeper into preparation. A binder began to take shape, each section meticulously labeled. Photographs of the yard, every flower, stone, and blade of grass, arranged neatly in protective sleeves. Copies of every letter from the HOA, each one dated and logged. Notes on conversations with neighbors, particularly the whispered warnings about Karen. Piece by piece, a case was being built. The resolve only grew stronger when another small detail came to light. A neighbor mentioned that Karen had bragged at the last HOA meeting about cleaning up the street, ensuring everyone fell into line with her vision of perfection. She had made it clear that individuality was a disease to be stamped out, and the homeowner's yard, colorful, vibrant, and unapologetically different, had become her prime example. It was no longer just about compliance, it was about power. Karen wasn't protecting the neighborhood, she was weaponizing the HOA to impose her control. And if she won here, she would only grow bolder, finding new targets, tightening her grip until every yard looked exactly like hers: sterile, joyless, and uniform. The days that followed were filled with a tense silence, broken only by the faint rustle of blinds being pulled back. Karen watched constantly. Every movement in the yard seemed to draw her gaze. The homeowner felt it, the weight of her scrutiny, but met it with deliberate calm. Rather than tear out the landscaping, the homeowner doubled down, adding more vibrant flowers, refreshing the mulch, trimming the edges until they looked sharp enough to cut. If Karen wanted a battle, she would be met with defiance in full bloom. When the next HOA board meeting rolled around, the homeowner attended. The atmosphere inside was suffocating, the air thick with the kind of polite hostility that only grows in tightly controlled communities. The board members sat in a row, papers stacked neatly in front of them, their expressions guarded. Karen sat among them, her smile thin and smug, like a predator waiting to pounce. The homeowner laid out their evidence: photos of the yard, citations from the rule book, proof that nothing violated any written standard. The presentation was calm, methodical, impossible to dismiss. For a brief moment, it seemed to work. Some board members shifted uncomfortably, their expressions suggesting doubt. But Karen spoke quickly, her words dripping with authority. She twisted the conversation, insisting that the spirit of the rules mattered more than the letter. Uniformity, she claimed, was essential to property values. Non-conforming yards were disruptive, even harmful. It was a masterful performance of manipulation, one she had likely perfected over years of petty battles. And in the end, the board sided with her. The fines would stand. The yard was still illegal. The homeowner walked out of that meeting with the weight of frustration pressing heavily on their shoulders. But underneath that frustration simmered something else: anger, sharp and unyielding. The board's decision wasn't the end of the battle. It was the beginning of war. If the HOA could bend the rules to suit Karen's whims, then the fight had to move beyond the confines of their little meetings. It was time to shine a light on their tactics, to expose the pettiness and corruption for everyone to see. The neighborhood had lived under Karen's shadow for too long, quietly enduring her control. But what if they saw her for what she really was? What if they realized that she wasn't protecting the community, but suffocating it? The plan began to take shape late one night, as the homeowner sifted through the growing stack of documents. Every threat, every fine, every manipulative phrase, it was all there, waiting to be used, and not just in a private defense. This was material for the public eye. The first step was gathering stories. Quiet conversations with neighbors revealed a pattern. Others had been targeted too, pressured into repainting homes, replacing fences, or tearing out gardens they loved. Most had complied, but not out of agreement, out of fear. Karen had been running the whole like her own personal kingdom, and the board had been too weak or too complicit to stop her. The homeowner realized they weren't alone. They had allies, even if those allies were too scared to stand openly. And with their support, silent though it might be, the foundation for resistance grew stronger. The yard remained untouched, standing defiantly against the growing threats. Each day the homeowner tended to it carefully, watering flowers, trimming hedges, not only out of pride but out of principle. To Karen, it was defiance. To the homeowner, it was freedom. The conflict had now reached a boiling point. The HOA had drawn its line in the sand, and the homeowner had refused to step back. The question was no longer whether this battle could be won, it was how much damage Karen and the board were willing to risk in their obsession with control. And as the homeowner prepared for the next move, one truth became clear. The fight was no longer about a yard. It was about exposing the rotten heart of the HOA itself. The HOA had made its position clear. No amount of evidence, no amount of reason was going to change their ruling. Karen had them under her influence, and as long as she sat on the board, the system itself was rigged. But where the HOA had its rules and fines, the homeowner had something much more powerful: exposure. It started with small steps. A post on a community forum, carefully worded, sharing the story of the so-called illegal yard. Pictures were attached: a vibrant, colorful garden filled with flowers, neatly trimmed hedges, and an immaculate lawn. Side by side, screenshots of the HOA notices labeled the yard as a violation. The contrast was undeniable. Anyone looking at the images could see the absurdity. Comments began to trickle in, first from strangers outside the neighborhood who were outraged at the heavy-handedness, then from locals who recognized the familiar pattern. The story spread quickly, carried by the universal frustration people feel toward overreaching HOA letters. Within days, it was being shared across social media platforms. Memes appeared, mocking the idea of a beautiful yard being illegal. The absurdity resonated, and what had once been an isolated battle suddenly had a growing audience. Neighbors began to whisper again, but this time, the whispers were different. Some quietly knocked on the door, offering their own stories of harassment. One had been fined for leaving a recycling bin out for a single night. Another for a garden gnome that disrupted uniformity. A third recalled being threatened for a small vegetable patch. In the backyard, Karen's reach had extended into nearly every home, leaving behind a trail of resentment. The homeowner documented it all: names, dates, details. Each account became another piece of evidence in the growing case against the HOA's corruption. It was no longer just one person's word against Karen's. It was a collective voice, a chorus of frustration finally being amplified. But Karen was not oblivious. She saw the posts, heard the whispers, and reacted with predictable fury. More notices appeared, more fines piled up. The letters became increasingly aggressive, filled with legal jargon meant to intimidate. The whole board, likely pressured by Karen's constant insistence, announced a hearing to formally address the yard violations and to determine further penalties. It was framed as a procedural matter, but everyone knew what it really was: an attempt to crush resistance once and for all. The homeowner, however, was ready. The binder of evidence had grown into a full arsenal: photos, testimonies, rule book contradictions, and now the growing public outrage, all of it prepared for that hearing. But there was one more step. In the days leading up to the meeting, the homeowner reached out to local media, small-town papers, online blogs, even a local news station with a reputation for covering community controversies. The pitch was simple: a homeowner being bullied by an hoe over a yard that broke no rules. Reporters, always eager for stories that stir public emotion, were intrigued. A crew promised to attend the hearing, cameras ready to capture whatever unfolded. The night of the hearing arrived. The boardroom, usually filled with only a handful of bored residents, was packed. Neighbors, reporters, and even strangers who had followed the story online crowded the small space. Karen sat at the head of the board's table, visibly rattled but trying to maintain her composure. She hadn't expected this kind of attention. Her power thrived in silence and compliance, not under the glare of cameras and curious eyes. The proceedings began, stiff and formal, the board reading from prepared statements. They described the yard as non-compliant, though once again, they failed to cite a specific rule. When pressed, Karen interjected, spinning vague notions of community harmony and aesthetic standards. But this time, her words fell flat. Too many people were listening. Too many eyes were watching. When the homeowner finally presented their case, the room shifted. The binder was opened. Each page laid out methodically. Photos of the pristine yard, screenshots of the handbook, testimonies from neighbors who had suffered under Karen's scrutiny, even examples of her overreach that bordered on absurdity. Every piece chipped away at the authority the HOA tried to project, and with reporters documenting every word, there was no hiding behind vague statements or intimidation tactics. The tension in the room was palpable. For years, Karen had operated unchecked, her power unquestioned, but now exposed under the harsh light of accountability. She looked smaller, her authority unraveling with every passing moment. The board faltered. Some members tried to defend their decision, but their words were weak, unconvincing. Others sat silently, unwilling to align themselves too closely with Karen now that the tide was turning. The hearing, intended to crush defiance, had instead become a showcase of the HOA's corruption. By the time it ended, nothing had been resolved formally. The board announced they would review the matter further, but the damage was already done. The community had seen behind the curtain. They had witnessed the pettiness, the manipulation, and the control for themselves. Walking out of the meeting, the homeowner felt something new: momentum. The fight was no longer a private struggle. It was a movement. And while Karen would surely double down in her efforts, the balance of power had shifted. She wasn't the hunter anymore. She was the hunted. The war was far from over, but for the first time, victory felt possible. The fallout from the hearing was immediate. Though the board tried to downplay the spectacle, word spread through the neighborhood faster than wildfire. Neighbors who had once whispered now spoke more openly, emboldened by the sight of Karen being challenged so publicly. For the first time, her authority seemed fragile, but with fragility came fury, and Karen's retaliation was swift. Within a week, a barrage of new violations arrived in the homeowner's mailbox, each one more absurd than the last. A warning about the mailbox being improperly painted, a notice claiming the garden hose was visible from the street, a supposed breach of uniformity, even a citation for a bird feeder hanging from a tree branch, deemed an unapproved structure. It was a calculated campaign of harassment, designed to bury the homeowner in so many accusations that resistance would become exhausting. The board, predictably, backed her. Their signatures appeared at the bottom of every notice, their complicity plain for all to see. They were no longer just enforcing rules, they were punishing defiance. Every letter carried the unmistakable stench of spite. But where Karen saw intimidation, the homeowner saw opportunity. Each new notice was photographed, filed, and cataloged. The binder grew thicker, its pages now brimming with evidence not only of unfair treatment, but of outright abuse of authority. The ridiculousness of the claims spoke for themselves, painting Karen not as a vigilant protector of the community, but as a petty tyrant obsessed with control. Neighbors noticed too. Some began quietly leaving notes of support in the mailbox, thanking the homeowner for standing up when they themselves had been too afraid. A few even started to speak openly at gatherings, sharing their own stories of being fined for trivial or imaginary violations. What had once been isolated resentment was beginning to crystallize into collective anger. Karen, however, was not finished. Her next move was more personal. A rumor began to circulate, one that suggested the homeowner was behind on mortgage payments, that foreclosure was looming. It was a lie, but one carefully seeded, whispered at block parties and casual encounters, designed to erode credibility. Suddenly, neighbors who had once been supportive looked uncertain, caught between sympathy and suspicion. It was a cruel tactic, but not an unexpected one. Karen thrived on controlling narratives, twisting perceptions until her victims looked like villains. But this time, she had underestimated her opponent. The homeowner countered the rumor by going bigger, leaning into the public spotlight that had already begun to grow. A call was made to a local investigative reporter who specialized in exposing corruption and abuse of power. The binder, now overflowing with evidence, was handed over. Within days, the reporter confirmed interest in running a full story, not just about one yard, but about the entire HOAS pattern of abuse under Karen's influence. The possibility of exposure terrified the board. For years, they had operated in the shadows of their little fiefdom, their actions confined to meeting notes no one read and letters no one questioned. But a news report would strip away that veil. Suddenly, their decisions wouldn't just be neighborhood gossip, they would be headlines. Karen, sensing the danger, escalated further. She called for an emergency board meeting, one that excluded the homeowner entirely. Behind closed doors, she pushed for legal action, claiming the homeowner's defiance was harming property values and creating division. She wanted court involvement, a lawsuit designed to drain resources and force compliance. But even among the board, cracks were forming. Some members, already uncomfortable with the circus the HOA had become, hesitated. The thought of their names attached to a public lawsuit, of being dragged into the growing storm, was enough to make them waver. Karen's grip, once ironclad, was beginning to slip. Meanwhile, the homeowner uncovered something unexpected. In reviewing the HOAS financial records documents made public under state law, there were irregularities, payments that didn't add up, expenses listed without explanation, even signs of funds being diverted for purposes unrelated to community upkeep. It was a discovery with teeth. While Karen had been weaponizing petty rules, the real violation lay within the HOA itself. Armed with this new information, the homeowner realized the battlefield had shifted. No longer was it about defending a yard. It was about dismantling the very structure Karen had built her power on. If the financial irregularities were exposed, the HOA could face audits, legal penalties, and possibly even dissolution. The homeowner knew the risks. Karen would not go down quietly. She would claw, threaten, and manipulate until her last breath of authority. But the homeowner was no longer standing alone. Neighbors were watching. The media was circling. And with evidence of financial misconduct, the balance of power was tilting. What began as a petty notice about an illegal yard was now on the verge of unraveling the entire HOA. And for Karen, the consequences would reach far beyond a simple neighborhood squabble. The next move would determine everything. The discovery of financial irregularities shifted everything. What had once been a personal battle over a yard had transformed into something larger, something systemic. Karen had built her power on the HOAS authority, but that authority rested on trust. And if the trust was broken, if the neighborhood saw what was really happening behind closed doors, the whole empire would collapse. The homeowner began piecing the evidence together. Copies of bank statements, meeting budgets, and maintenance invoices that didn't match actual expenses. Payments recorded to contractors that never seemed to appear on the street. Landscaping charges for work that had never been performed. At first glance, it might have looked like sloppy bookkeeping, but patterns emerged, patterns that suggested money was flowing into places it didn't belong. The homeowner worked with the investigative reporter, who verified each document and quietly reached out to financial experts. Their verdict was damning. At minimum, gross mismanagement. At worst, outright fraud. Either way, it was a story that could not be ignored. Meanwhile, Karen's harassment reached a fever pitch. Another round of violation letters arrived, piling so thick they nearly filled the mailbox. The HOA threatened court action formally this time, claiming the homeowner was in breach of contract and owed thousands in accumulated fines. The letterhead was bold, the legal jargon heavy, but the homeowner no longer flinched. The threat was meaningless compared to what was about to come. On a crisp morning not long after the story broke, the local news station aired the segment, leading with footage of the illegal yard, vibrant, colorful, and undeniably pristine. The anchor then cut to interviews with neighbors, some of whom were willing to speak on camera. They described years of petty fines, intimidation, and harassment, and finally, the report unveiled the financial irregularities, with experts questioning where tens of thousands of dollars in whole funds had gone. Karen's face, caught on camera as she stormed away from reporters outside her home, became the image that defined the broadcast. For years, she had ruled with impunity. Now, she was the villain in a public scandal, her reputation crumbling in real time. The fallout was immediate. Phones buzzed, social media erupted, and neighbors flooded the homeowner with messages of support. Those who had once been silent out of fear now spoke freely. Meetings were demanded. Petitions circulated. The same residents who had once looked away from Karen's tyranny now rallied together, united by outrage and betrayal. The HOA board, sensing the tidal wave of anger, scrambled to distance themselves. They issued a statement claiming ignorance of the financial issues, promising a full internal review. But no one bought it. Their signatures had been on every letter, their silence complicit in every fine. The neighborhood wanted accountability, not excuses. Karen, however, refused to back down. She doubled down in the only way she knew how, by lashing out. She filed a lawsuit personally, naming the homeowner as the source of defamation and emotional distress. It was a desperate move, a final attempt to reclaim control through intimidation, but it backfired spectacularly. The lawsuit drew even more media attention, and with the financial evidence already under investigation, her claims looked hollow and self-serving. The homeowner, once a target of ridicule and suspicion, now stood as a symbol of resistance. The yard, once mocked as illegal, had become a banner of individuality and defiance. Neighbors who passed by no longer averted their eyes, they stopped to admire it, to thank the homeowner for standing firm. Behind the scenes, investigations deepened. The county began auditing the HOA's finances. Spurred by the news report and growing public pressure, officials subpoenaed records, questioned board members, and traced payments. Whispers of fraud turned into official allegations, and the possibility of legal consequences for Karen loomed larger by the day. For the homeowner, the transformation was surreal. Months earlier, they had felt isolated and powerless, their every move scrutinized and punished. Now, the balance had shifted entirely. The HOA was on the defensive, its authority collapsing under scrutiny, its queen dethroned in the court of public opinion. Yet even as victory seemed near, the homeowner knew the war wasn't finished. Karen wasn't the type to surrender quietly. She had invested too much of herself in this control, too much of her identity wrapped around the HOA's power. She would fight until the very end, no matter how futile, and the board, though fractured, still had remnants of influence. The final battle wasn't just about fines or even financial misconduct. It was about reclaiming the neighborhood itself, about ensuring that the shadow of fear Karen had cast for years would never return. The homeowner looked out over the yard one evening, the sun setting behind vibrant rows of flowers. What had started as a notice taped to a door had grown into something far greater. It was no longer just about personal pride, it was about justice, community, and the simple right to live without being crushed by arbitrary control. The last laugh was near, but it would not be quiet. It would echo through the neighborhood, through the courts, and through every resident who had ever lived under Karen's reign. The stage was set for the final showdown. The neighborhood had grown restless. Once, meetings were dull affairs, sparsely attended and dominated by Karen's voice. Now, the community center overflowed with residents, their faces determined, their voices louder than ever before. The news reports had ignited something that couldn't be extinguished: awareness. For the first time, the HOA's authority was being questioned, not by one brave homeowner alone, but by nearly everyone who lived under its rule. Investigations into the HOA's finances moved quickly. County officials uncovered missing funds, falsified invoices, and suspicious contracts that led back to companies connected to Karen's acquaintances. What she had once dismissed as management expense is now stood as glaring red flags. The audit concluded with a recommendation for legal prosecution. Suddenly, The woman who had spent years weaponizing rules against her neighbors found herself the subject of criminal inquiries. The board tried to save themselves, distancing from Karen, resigning quietly in hopes of escaping scrutiny. But their names were already printed in newspapers. Their signatures attached 2 years of notices and fines. Their complicity couldn't be erased, and they would face consequences too, even if less severe than Karen. The lawsuit Karen had filed against the homeowner collapsed almost instantly. The judge dismissed it outright, citing lack of evidence and labeling it frivolous. The courtroom was packed with reporters, and the moment Karen's case was thrown out, whispers of satisfaction rippled through the crowd. For once, she was not the enforcer, she was the defeated. Back in the neighborhood, change arrived like a tide. A petition circulated to dissolve the HOA entirely. Families who had lived in fear of Karen's notices signed eagerly, their pens scratching away years of resentment. When the vote was tallied, the outcome was decisive. The HOA was disbanded, its authority stripped away. Its reign ended. Karen's home, once pristine and intimidating, became a symbol of her downfall. Her blinds, once always tilted to spy on neighbors, now stayed closed. Where she had once walked the streets with an air of superiority, she now stayed hidden, her name spoken only with bitterness or ridicule. The woman who had made others' lives miserable now lived surrounded by a community that celebrated her loss of power. For the homeowner, the victory was more than personal, it was poetic. The yard, vibrant and unapologetically different, became the centerpiece of the street. Neighbors stopped to admire it, children played near its flowers, and passers-by smiled at its defiance. What had once been labeled illegal was now embraced as the heart of the block, a reminder that individuality could thrive even in the face of oppression. The investigative reporter returned for a follow-up story, capturing footage of the homeowner tending to the garden. This time, the narrative wasn't about conflict but triumph. The segment highlighted how one person's refusal to bow to intimidation had sparked a movement that dismantled years of unchecked authority. It ended with a simple shot of the yard, blooming in full color, with the caption, "The last laugh." Neighbors, too, found freedom in the aftermath. Some began projects they had long suppressed, planting vegetable gardens, painting shutters in bold colors, decorating yards with whimsical ornaments. The neighborhood blossomed with individuality, each home reflecting the personality of its residents. It was messy, imperfect, and wonderfully alive. As for Karen, her fate unraveled slowly, but decisively. Legal battles drained her finances. Former allies abandoned her, and when charges related to financial misconduct were finally filed, she became a cautionary tale. Her name synonymous with overreach and control gone too far. She had sought absolute power, but in the end, her obsession left her isolated and disgraced. The homeowner, standing on the porch one quiet evening, looked out over the yard with a deep sense of satisfaction. The flowers swayed in the breeze, their colors catching the last rays of sunlight. What had started as a slip of paper taped to a door had ended with the collapse of an entire system of control. The last laugh was theirs, not in a single moment of triumph, but in every day that followed, days free of arbitrary fines, days filled with neighbors who no longer lived in fear, days where the yard flourished not as defiance, but as a symbol of resilience. It was never just about the yard. It had always been about standing up to pettiness, to injustice, to the suffocating grip of control. And in winning, the homeowner had given the entire neighborhood a gift, freedom. And so, the story closed not with bitterness, but with bloom. The illegal yard had never been illegal at all. It had simply been ahead of its time.